My name is Carl McKay. I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today an amazing panel, the New Age NFL Front Office. Today's panelists are Scott Pioli, former NFL executive of the New England Patriots and other teams, Larissa Horton, CEO of Sumer Sports, Kevin Demoff, president, Los Angeles Rams, and our panel is moderated by Bill Connolly, staff writer at ESPN. Let's put our hands together for the panel.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks to Carl. He was immensely helpful with prep here. So I'm going to start this out. Well, I think my first Sloan was 2012. And I pretty clearly remember those first few years. They're talking about the advances different sports are making. Baseball's already exploded. Basketball is in the process of exploding at that point. And, Daryl would get to football and just be like, well, they need to go for it more on fourth downs, and then just move on to other sports. And clearly over the last 10 to 12 years, that's changed quite a bit, and I'm pretty excited about getting to talk about some of the advances that have come, not only through analytics, but just in the front office in general. So I'm going to start this panel like every panel should start, with a Bill Walsh quote. In his football Bible, Finding the Winning Edge, Bill Walsh talked about outliers. He said, he noted that, 6 to 10 plays can impact a game or impact a season, whether you were under 500 or made the playoffs. But the good teams kind of stayed good. And then, as he put it, interestingly, the negative outliers tend to be the same teams year after year. I don't know if he actually had a catty tone when he said that, or if I just hear that myself. But I wanted to start with Larissa. You're new to football in general. And you can serve as a fresh set of eyes in that regard. But for what you've learned so far, what are the biggest reasons those negative outliers, without naming any names, may be struggling to keep up right now? Where do you think there are opportunities for advancement there?
Well, first off, excited and honored to be here with you guys. Like you said, I am new to football. I've been here now about 8 months. And I've been surrounded by some amazing folks who have decades of experience. We have 600 years of NFL experience at Sumer. And we've actually had a lot of these discussions and debates about why are teams the way they are, how have they not changed, what's going on. And the debate typically spawns two conversations. It's what is the scout's view, the experienced eye, versus what are we seeing in data? And how are the opinions the same or different? And interestingly, there's, as unexpected, there are things that are very common, and we didn't think they spent enough on the offensive line, or we didn't think that that was the right bet on the right quarterback. And there's a couple key ingredients that were very necessary when we look at all of the various, teams that have won Super Bowls or are in playoffs. And, some of those ingredients just didn't show up in some of these teams and consistently struggled. And the why they struggled, we looked not just at player evaluation, but the cap situations. And that cap situation has a huge impact, obviously, on the selection or available supply and demand that you can have access to. But you mentioned the same mistakes happening over and over again. I think this is where some of the human bias of what you believe is the winning formula does show up sometimes, right? And that's where the interesting debates happen for us is, okay, like we did this already, we tried this already and it didn't work. Why do we think it's gonna work this time? Like, what are we gonna do differently, or what's gonna happen differently from our previous hypothesis that will make it work this time? And so the data has been interesting for that. And someone not in football versus folks who have been in football, I think it's highlighted some very different insights.
And Scott, along those lines, what are the defining characteristics, I guess, of good versus bad?
Well, I think what she's talking about is preparation, right? And how do you prepare not only for the game itself, but the organization in the offseason, the decisions you make that are talent acquisition, talent identification, and talent development. And I think some of it comes back to, Bill, we talked about this a little bit earlier. It's really important to be smart and to be forward thinking. But before you do that, you have to get the basic stuff right. And a lot of the winning and losing and the repetitive winning and losing, whether it's the decision making made by a franchise or made on game day, I think comes back to a lot of fundamental things, fundamentals, certain disciplines, right? Penalties, turnovers, not doing dumb stuff. And you know, Kevin was with one of, or is with one of the youngest, was one of the youngest and smartest coaches in the league. However, his teams, generally speaking, aren't heavily penalized. They don't have a lot of turnovers. They don't do dumb stuff at bad times. They're prepared for situations. And those are just basic, very fundamental things. So when it comes to the teams and franchises, I think it's not just the on the field Sunday, well, can't even say Sunday anymore, game day, the game day performance. It comes down to doing the fundamental basic things right. Then you can be smart and do smart things or smarter things. But that also happens, I think, in the off-season decision-making as well.
Now, Kevin, you're obviously part of a pretty smart organization, and you're actually kind of part of two different organizations at the same time. You know, seems like you have a couple hats here, but how does overseeing, what is it, team and media operations for the Kroenke Group as a whole, how does that inform how you oversee the Rams?
Look, I think you pick up on different patterns, as Scott said, and it's interesting to listen to the discussion. It's hard to believe this will be my 17th year with the Rams. I've been a negative outlier, as you discussed, for 8 years, and a positive outlier, you know, for 8 years, and you know, didn't have a winning season in my first 8, and you know, since we've hired Sean, we've had some pretty good success. And I think, you know, one of the things that's true to me over time is the greatest competitive, at least in football, and I think this is true now watching other sports, the greatest competitive advantage in sports is winning. And that sounds really dumb, except what it means is you get to keep your people together. You get to refine your processes. You get the confidence of, hey, we've made these decisions, they've worked, let's keep doing them. When you are a losing franchise, and we were very bad, and you know, when I got to the Rams, they had been 3-13 and 2-14, and one of the reasons I took the job, I said, there's nowhere to go but up. And we went 1-15. And it's like, okay, the next time you say that, you better be winless. But when you're chasing winning, you always think there's a shortcut, or you think that you don't know what it looks like. And so when you get in the moment, the decisions you're making may seem right at the time, but you don't have, you know, a standard to compare them to. I think that's where when you go through each year, it's like, hey, this is what winning looks like. And I think for a franchise, when you carry it over into whether it's basketball, hockey, soccer, the worst thing we've done in sports is we have shortened the time frames of GMs across any timeline. And we've incentivized them to think short term, and we don't give them the time to actually test theories, see if they work, course correct, and go through it. And I think when you go through these things, you learn like, hey, the core decency of what you have and how you build, what are your fundamental principles? If after 2 years, your job is on the line, the social and human dynamics take over any of this. This is, you know, building teams in sports is art, not science. And so much of that art comes from outside critics' views of what is good art and what's not. And so I think once you factor that in, and it's what is, you know, these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. You have an owner, you have fans, you have customers. What do they think? And it is impossible for that not to filter into the decision-making when you're struggling. And so you're balancing a lot of different things versus, I think, you know, and Scott can say, once you're an established winning franchise, you can block most of that out because you know, I mean, we'll make decisions right now and they may be batshit crazy and people will be like, oh, but we trust Sean and Les. If we had made those decisions in 2013, people would be like, you're batshit crazy. Right? And, you know, and I think that's the difference of the way the world operates.
That's part of the entitlement that comes with success until you're dumb again, right? But you mentioned that the giving someone time. Kevin, I look at your career. You know, there were people trying to run you off early on and hold, you know.
Rightfully so.
No, I respectfully disagree, and not just because you're a friend, it's because you had put certain things in place. You've got to give smart decision makers, or you've got to give people, allow their processes to manifest themselves, because that's what we're putting in place is processes. And if the time frame is too short and we're over analyzing things in that moment, you don't get to see the process run its course.
Is it just the process, or is there you mentioned kind of a learning cycle of trying something, it's okay to fail, having the psychological safety of, I'm not just going to get let go after 1 year.
He didn't
And-
have psychological safety. No, seriously. No, because they were calling for
Yeah.
him, and not rightfully so.
But then there's also, I think, coming from an outside point of view, the measurement of some of that. How do we incorporate what you are saying is situationally batshit crazy here, but not anymore because of the trust and the leverage? But at the same time, like when we look at it, we're looking at just a purely analytical view, plus obviously the human experience. And I think there are some things that we can look back at and say, this was a good decision. Subjectively, objectively, what were the different conversations? And how does that change when you bring some of that measurement into that conversation?
Look, I think people look at what they think are good decisions at the time, right? And I think going back to where Bill started, which Bill Walsh, I do believe, there are a handful of plays that make up each game, a handful of plays each season. We could be sitting here with a Super Bowl ring right now if we correctly blocked a 3rd and 2 against the Eagles. We didn't. That one play may have changed. Now, we came back, Eagles were deserving champions, but we can look back on one play and say that may have changed the trajectory of our franchise for a long time. And so when you add those up and you get to a certain number of times, but what I say, and I always say this, like if you look at NFL franchises, and I believe it's true in other leagues, there are 32 teams. They all spend $10 to $15 million on scouting. The collective wisdom is usually not all that wrong. But it's like, where do you find those little differences that make 2 to 3 plays a game stacked up over time? And usually it is betting on something that is not standardly agreed upon. It is taking a swing outside of how people would view the normal world, and then that works, and then you do it again, you get confidence, and until people figure out kind of what you're doing, you get that short-term competitive advantage. The thing in the NFL, I think it's true in all leagues, is that erodes very quickly.
Yeah.
People
Right?
adjust.
The IP within your franchise gets distributed pretty quickly, and then now that's gone.
So every GM hired since 2022 is under 50. And of the 4 that were hired this young offseason, 2 are under 40, one's under 35. There's still some veterans out there, but recent trends kind of suggest that teams think they need a young hotshot to run whatever the kind of the new GM role is at this point. Starting with Scott, like how have the
guy who's way over 50.
the core competencies of being a GM, like to you, how much has that changed, or what's changed the most, I guess?
Oh, I think what I've seen change the most, it's interesting because when I started in it, it didn't have the GM title, but I had the GM-ish role. I was 34. I think what I've seen through all the iterations is, quite honestly, the number of people that you have to manage. Yes, the game has changed. Yes, analytics is changing it. There's always been analytics. Oh, by the way, we just as some of we old folks never, resist the word analytics. But to me, it's been it's the number of people that you have to manage in the role of general manager, and the diversity, which is actually, it's a blessing, because you're getting diversity of thought, you're getting diversity of bias, you're getting diversity of culture, you're getting all these different voices, right? We have all these new departments now that we're adding. The owners don't like it a whole lot because it's headcount and salaries, but you're managing more people. And I think when you're in that role of general manager, that there's more people and more differences that you have to try to pull together. I think there's also, just as the world has evolved in a positive way, it's the culture of the internal building has changed dramatically, and how things are handled, how people speak, how they don't speak. I think that's probably the biggest change that I've seen, the enormity and the breadth of the people that are involved in it.
And Kevin, along those same lines, 16 years as Rams president, thinking back to the first year, what's unrecognizable from then to now, just in terms of how the front office as a whole is?
Everything has changed. I mean, you can't, I don't think, Scott says, you can't look at the 2000s now versus, the way the world is. I mean, technology has evolved. I mean, my first time speaking at Sloan was in 2008, in a basement at MIT. And I think the thing is, right, like if you look at how people's thought processes evolve, but the one thing that goes back, like back then GMs used to get 5 years, and there was a very clear progression of how you became a GM. And I think that's got thrown into the wayside. And you could argue for better or for worse. I think one of the things we did, I think at the Rams, which helped us be successful, is we really split the job into two functions, which is helping pick players and then helping run the building. And because often what we do in sports, and I think this is true kind of across, is we'll take people who have come from good franchises who might be the number 2 in charge and in charge of scouting and put them in the role of GM. And we assume then that they learn the skill set of how you manage people in a building every day, how you work with the trainer and the head coach. And that may not be their skill set. And oh, by the way, nobody in time has ever said, we're going to send you to a course to develop your leadership skills or your soft skills or any of the things that most of us who go through real life training go through. We just say, you were good at picking players this one place, even though we don't know that you were picking the players there. And now we're going to presume that you can do it here with a new coach and a new ecosystem. And I always say NFL franchises, and this is true across all sport, we do crazy stuff. You make a change, no Fortune 500 company would ever be like, you know what, we're firing our CEO, CMO, CFO, and CTO all in the same week. And then we're going to replace them all in 2 weeks from a competitor, but we can't have people who are in those positions. We have to pick the underlings of those positions, right? That's an insane way to build a long-term successful franchise. And I think when you start to push that through, it's okay, how do we find, I think the NFL has gotten much better at what are your skill sets? Where do you thrive? How do we let you do that? And how do we build a support system around you in the same way that former GMs didn't get the shot? But I do think and this is a curiosity I've always wondered, and Scott, we do not let GMs who failed the first time come back the same way we do anybody else. And that's really unfair because I think what you would learn, if there was one job in the NFL, I think where you would learn on the job, as you said, and grow, it's at the GM spot because it is very different than anything you've done before.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because when you look at the number of head coaches, for instance, that are given second chances and then have success, right? You need to fail to have success or to learn or to have things, embedded in a certain way. And when you look at, and no one's talked about this a whole lot publicly, I know Thomas talks about this quite a bit. If you look at the GMs that have gold jackets, they all had very rough former lives, right? Whether it was, George Young may be the only one that wasn't fired but Bill Polian was fired twice, I think, before he went to the Colts and had that great run. Bobby Beathard, he's been, that it happened to him. Ron Wolf, Ron Wolf was a part of that Jets franchise back in the day that was really rough. So not getting a second chance or that second opportunity, it's a really curious thing. I don't think anyone's ever really come up with the answer to it, but it lends into this other part where we're talking about, some of the success that we had at the Patriots. Part of when we talk about diversity, Bill, we talked about this earlier, the diversity is the diversity of experienced minds within. It's not just cultural, it's not just gender, race. We always made sure that we had, I don't know if I can say this, but old people around, right? We had Bucko Kilroy, when we went to the Patriots. I spent a lot of time with Bucko. When we were, every place we went, we had older people that had experiences and a different type of intelligence and perspective to add to that. And I think that's a really important, I answered your question, but I also think that if you're a young person and you get in a role, having experienced people around you can really, really help. And I looked at you, you've got a group of experienced people that you're helping them and they're helping you.
Yeah,
and in your career, Kevin, your father's experience, even though, so having that experienced person really helps.
You mentioned culture and leadership. So having not been in football, I've been a leader for almost 2 decades. And this is where I think the kind of diversity of thought that you're willing to bring in and how you leverage that diversity for a better outcome is definitely a big part of how we've built the team. All of these scouts have done things I've never done. I'm never going to be a GM. That's perfectly fine. But how do we find the better of the two as we bring that technology to the surface? And really, we're trying to understand what are the challenges that GMs are facing every single day, and how do we help aid that more than anything? Because it is a high-risk job, right? It is being gone after a year is very difficult. We know every single week matters. And so the perspective we've been taking at Sumer is, of all the things that you're doing, how can we help you do it faster, better, with a little more confidence? And that confidence comes from both the experienced folks that we have in the company, as well as the technology that helps you do things very differently. And it's hard. It's hard because, as we had talked, experience gives you confidence that you're doing the right thing the right way. And so when you become one of the 32 GMs, which there's only 32, or sorry, you start to ask yourself, why do I need to do something different? Why do I need to listen to someone different with a different point of view? Where we've, I think, found a really good medium is, let me find the problems you have and how technology can help that. And whether it's the famous one me and Thomas talk about is, I finished a game, I get a phone call for a trade, and I need to figure out, what do I do? I have to call people, I need to figure out trades in history, I need to figure out how it'll impact my cap. I'm like, how long does that typically take you? He's like, well, it depends. It depends on the systems, it depends on the people, it depends on the team. Like, okay, but what if we can have that in the palm of your hand, and now you see all the information within seconds? How does that change how you work and how you execute as an executive? And by the way, your team is still there to support you, to go and dig in deeper, to find that next edge. But there's some things that can be easier, that can be faster, so that you can perform at the next level and continue to find that next edge as a team. And that's really how we've been talking about supporting the GM role and the evolution of that GM role while leveraging all of the experience that's there.
Yeah, so to spin this towards analytics a little bit, it's clear that analytics departments are far higher volume than they were 10 or 15 years ago, and there's more influence overall. But starting with Larissa, what are the areas for improvement there as far as properly working analytics just into your general decision-making framework? Or like where's that's still kind of lacking?
So we've met with a lot of teams. Everyone has an analytics department. Everyone has hired great people. I don't think it's a question of whether there's analytics or not in a club. I think you guys have mentioned this as well. There's always been analytics there. I think the question is, what is it that an outside vendor can provide to a franchise that's different? We aren't a club. We are not chasing a win every single week. We have a little bit of a longer term in terms of ability to invest and create and innovate. And so we're able to bring tools that are sometimes harder to build inside of the club. We were able to do deep research. So one of the things that we recently launched and showed is frame level analytics. So yes, we talk about snaps, but now we're looking at every frame, what do we think is gonna happen and what's the probability of things happening? Now, if we take what you do at a frame, at a snap, at a game, and now predicting that across a season, you have a different view. One of the things that we had to do is tie that all back to film. Why? Because when we go and talk to customers, the clubs, the colleges, they're like, well, I don't know if I believe you. I don't know if I believe, what you graded this person or what you thought was gonna happen here. We're like, that's fine. You don't have to believe everything we say. It's another data point for you to use to evaluate, was there an edge here that I didn't take advantage of, or was there, a situation here? And this is really us looking more at the anomalies of what we're finding more than anything else. And so I think the evolution is really, you have the analytics team, but how do you raise the waterline by starting at a different starting point, by leveraging a platform and a technology that's different?
And Kevin, along those same lines, like taking all this new insight and making it actually actionable, like what are the biggest challenges still, when it comes to that?
Look, I think the greatest challenges are getting them into the beginning of the process so that people don't know their analytics, right? Like, I think if you can, throughout your building, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether your head coach is rely upon them, your GM. I think if analytics are embedded in the initial inputs and information so that people don't recognize them as analytics. And I don't say that as a bad word, right? But like in our scouting systems, the way we operate, they're baked into every player profile, review, how we work, well before the scouts know it and well before the coaches, when they get to the draft, ever review it, right? And so therefore, it is not like the eye test versus the analytics, right? Like, because that's always going to be, especially in football, your hardest place to break things down. It's like, look, no, we're going to tell you that this is exactly how we look at the world, right? And one of the first places where we were very good at that as an organization is, not using 40 times, right? And I know whether it was Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua or Kyron, like that was one of the hallmarks of what we did, instead using 3-cone and other measures, of speed, because it was an inaccurate science. Now, if you still go to, a receivers coach and tell them that this player ran a 4.7, automatically in their minds, it's going to drop. It's one of the reasons we don't go to the combine anymore, or stopped going 5 years ago, because the first thing you see of a player is them running, right? No matter what, that's your first impression of them, versus, well, how did they play against Iowa State? And so I think you have to get that baked in so that it's not attention, that it's informative at the base rate, but not to the people who are going to be resistant to it. You do that. And then, ultimately, the more, and I think it's what Larissa did, the more it works, the more people are willing to be like, okay, I trust that when you tell me this player is faster than I think they are, to ignore the 40 times. But that takes, it goes back to where we started, 2 to 3 years of drafting a player, selecting them, having them be successful to go prove that this theory was right.
This is part of the fact, because exactly what you're talking about now, finding a way to have it baked in, it goes back to this diversity component that I keep thinking about, the diversity of thought. And one of the most important things is this human dynamic. And we've all agreed back when we were talking back there, is this human component and the human bringing people together, right? That's what teamwork is about. Regardless of the sport, you're trying to win a championship, and bringing people, it's not just bringing players together. It's not just bringing coaches together, right? With analytics, we're bringing two worlds, and we've brought another culture into the game that has thought one way for years and years and years. And the divide that existed there because of the insecurities of, and I will say this, as me as a old school football person, the insecurities that we would have when confronted with people of high, pure academic intellect, and the academic intellectual group with the insecurities they had that the football people showed every day, trying to bring, that's been the toughest part of bringing data and analytics to football, is the insecurities of both groups. And we talk about diversity and inclusion, and we're just thinking through this lens of race and gender. And when you're trying to build these new teams, right? Diversity isn't about just those things. It's about your biases, about where we come from, what our backgrounds are, and trying to bring this collective together for the greater good. And you're finding and have found some of the fixes to it. Then once it's there, then you train your people to behave better with one another. Where the people that come from the football background don't say, well, you never played the game, you never coach it, what do you know? And then the folks that come from a different background don't trigger the football people and say, well, we know how you got through school, right? They trigger the insecurity of the alleged lack of intelligence, but it comes back to the people and embedding it and finding different ways to manage it.
And I think that's exactly right. I mean, for better or for worse, if you go back to the beginnings of this conference and Moneyball, it was always that there was this tension between the two.
Right.
When you talked about, the way it was, when I started the Rams, I think back to prior to the Rams, we were in the market for a free agent center, and, we were trying to look at all these early analytics, and, I had this whole chart, and I walk in and I present to the head coach, and these are the three, and head coach goes and writes, "You're an idiot," and he writes WCIL, and I'm like, I don't know that data point. What is it? He goes, worst center in the league. And he goes, that's your guy. And I'm like, okay. And we would never, if you walked into Sean right now, he would never take it that way. He would take the data in a different way. We would never present it that way where there was this opportunity to compare the two. And, the things like PFF and other things have become part of the lexicon. I think that's probably for the worst, by the way, although I do think it gives some air cover to then come in and say, what are we looking at? But when there's so much human psychology that goes into this. If people think that, you have to win an argument, one of the great things Les Snead does in our building, he says, to support one player you like, you don't have to bash another player, right? You can like both of them, but you can say why you like someone more. And I think that's the truth with when we talk about analytics and coaching. You don't have to bash one thing to say, hey, I feel stronger about this. You can say, I can respect that, and it's a really strong point. I just lean more to this other side, and that can work either way.
As long as Les doesn't leave it with a bless your heart, and then goes to make his point.
There's
There's been always kind of this baked-in defensiveness a lot. You know, when you think about the generic nerd talking to the generic coach, and here's everything you're doing wrong, and so on. But obviously, there's been a lot of progress in that way. Like, what do you think are some of the points of progress? Like, how have analytics changed coaching over the last 5-10 years? Other than going for it on 4th and 1 now.
Unless you're Sean.
I'm sorry.
Unless you're Sean McVay, who still
Granted.
doesn't do it enough, but that's okay.
But has that still just been the most, 4th downs, they're a little more open to that, but have there been other?
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so again, I'm looking at it as an outsider coming in, and I look at what does every team do, what kind of risks are they taking, what have they done historically, and then we try to look at what do we think they're going to do if they're in that same situation moving forward. As part of looking at that, the team is looking at, well, what was slightly different in the times where it worked versus the times it didn't. Again, you're talking about, you said the nerd versus the coach, right? First off, they speak very different languages, so it's hard to find the common ground of why did something happen and what data points did one look at, or things did you look at, see, that made something happen versus not. But interestingly enough, I think there's insight in both, and I think you can actually find a better edge if you pull both of those points of view in slightly. I can't speak to what the coaches are doing now and how they're leveraging the analytics. We've talked to quite a few coaches more on the NCAA side who are looking at, it's a very different market, it's very competitive. I need to find a different edge. What are all the tools I can leverage to find a different edge? Because the world is changing. In their particular case, the world is changing drastically, right? The transfer portal has made some huge differences. And the number of people you have, the budget that you have is very different. And you don't have the resources or the manpower necessarily. And so this is where data has been a very different tool, I think, for those coaches. At the pro level, yeah.
To me, it's not, I think we're being just a little myopic here because I'm a big process person, right? So I go back to one of the biggest changes I've seen in terms of the coaching part is the preparation. So I love process, preparation, and we have so much that we do now with player tracking in terms of their load and the amount of work that they're doing and preparing for games and preparing for a season that's 16, 17, and about to be 18 games, and then if you're in the playoffs. So it's not just the in-game decision-making. To me, I think one of the greatest differences that I've seen as I observe teams and spend time both in college and professional is the preparation component and how much work is done and how much coaches, they do force upon their players in terms of the work they're not doing, or maybe how much more they can do to prepare, how much less they can do, what their sleep patterns are. I think so. The preparation part to me is where I've seen significant changes. Are there changes in game day? Absolutely. But I do think that there'll always be that part of the coaching that is a real thing. You've got these 11 interdependent relationships that are happening on every play, and there are so many variables. And Bill, you and I talked about the variable thing, whether, is the right guard playing with a really bad ankle? Does the quarterback have a shoulder injury or a rib injury that you may want to call a certain play or do a certain thing that seems to make sense in terms of going for it, not going for it? What are we have indoor stadiums, we have outdoor stadiums, we have different playing surfaces. There's so many, again, variables that change in our game. But to me, I see the preparation for coaches and what they do and don't play with players. That's been that analytics and data and the sports science world has really changed the game.
I look at it as, and if you follow the NBA arc where lots of these people who are video assistants have now come out and become younger coaches and gone up and grown, and obviously the embrace of technology, that when you start in charting and technology, and I think the NFL arc's become a little bit of the same way now from a coaching perspective. All of these coaches, as they get younger and younger, they started out, they were the smart whiz tech kids on the coaching staff with technology. And that's kind of how they got to start. And you can break down so much more information. And so I think there's just a greater appreciation for how technology can make their job simpler than there probably was, 20 years ago, when there was still this pride of, I used to splice up film and cut it off and do that.
Write down time code.
Yeah, right. And I mean, and I think that there's, that evolution gives them a greater appreciation for the value, of what's coming to them. And then if you start to pair, for better or for worse, younger coaches and younger GMs and younger people. But I do think there's this, I think Scott nails this, the diversity of thought of where people are coming from, and did you need to play the game and how you do it. That marriage in a building, the right formula, is coming together in a much more harmonious way. But also, I think one of the challenges that I think this is a negative for analytics, and like we have boiled it down to football into, did you go for it on 4th and 1? Did you, should you have, should you not? And there's so many, you can talk to Sean about this, often, defensive coordinators are more aggressive than offensive coordinators. A lot of them, half the league now, offensive play callers are head coaches, right? So you ask Sean, like, why did you not do it? He's like, I just didn't think we had a good play for 4th and 3. Everything we had tried hadn't worked. I didn't feel comfortable. That's a very different answer than, do I think we should have gone for it? Because in the answer, some of these things that we're looking at, these things are simulations over thousands of plays with data, but these coaches may get this decision 5 or 6 times a year. And so if it goes 50-50, they're like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that the base rate is 62% over, thousands of plays. Sean, and I say this, Sean gets a reputation for being one of the most conservative 4th down coaches that he is. He's the only play caller, though, in history. We had a playoff game in 2018, 4th and 1, up 7 points with under 8 minutes. He's the only play caller in history to go for it in that situation against the Cowboys. We scored, we went up 2 touchdowns, we won the game, we went to the Super Bowl, lost to the Patriots. But, to me, that's where, like, situationally it's very different. I think where we have always found analytics as it creeps in your organization, draft decision-making, some of those things that it's not binary yes or no, right? That you can, we have a saying within the Rams that you need to work to make your decisions work. It's not just the analytics. It's making that decision and then putting in the resources of your organization to support that. That is very different than what coaches go through on game day, where you can't work to make your decisions work. It either happens, a guy slips, you have to call a timeout, you get a delay of game. Like, everything can change very quickly. And that's why I think, we tend to focus on it from a game day philosophy, where I think it's much integrated into an organization in different ways.
The training angle is really interesting because we've seen this across many sports. As early as, I would say, 2013, 2014, in NBA, MLS, there's really interesting training analytics around how many steps is someone taking, how much salt is there in their sweat, like all of these kinds of things. And it was really targeting preventative injury and trying to, minimize that risk. As we've looked at what is possible in the NFL, I think there are still rules around tracking outside of the club that are very different than other sports, where you get a very holistic view. You mentioned sleep, right? Like, are you allowed to track the sleep and all activities outside of the club?
We asked them to track it for us.
Yes, but this is where I think working around the rules has been interesting, whereas other leagues have leaned into, it's for the benefit of the player, longevity of their career, and their overall health. And I think the ownership or the leadership side looks at it as, I made a huge investment, I want to make sure that investment pans out, and I'm not introducing risk that I could have prevented if possible. But again, this is more of a, here's what we've been seeing from how it was used and incorporated. How it then gets adopted into football, I think, is different per franchise.
So to get to, I think these questions are related. I want to get to a couple of audience questions. Number one is, you touched on trying to get experienced old people.
And I'm not looking for a job. That's not why I say that.
Have there been situations where, older people have a certain stubbornness towards moves or decisions in a modern context because, they've been doing things differently for their career? Along those same lines is another question. As the role of analytics in decision-making increases, does that mean that the role of human intuition is decreasing at the same time? Like, how do you balance those two things in an appropriate manner?
Yeah, I think I'll take the first question first. Like, look, I've sat in this room. I was fortunate to get my job at a young age. I think there's this suspicion of, like, they're old and stubborn and boomers. Like, if you can't have the people in your organization who will push back on questions and not create healthy dialogue, you're not going to get to the right answers. And just being dismissive of people on either spectrum, means you're likely to fail. That holistic perspective I think Scott's talking about, and it can come from anywhere, which is challenge each other and walk out and be willing to embrace being uncomfortable. And, and I think, I watched James Gladstone, who just got hired as the Jags GM and came from our organization 34, like where James's superpower will be is like, he would lead our draft meetings and he could ask questions to really encourage debate. He didn't necessarily believe in some of the things he was asking or saying. He did it to make sure that others' viewpoints were heard. And then at the end, you had a more holistic discussion of how it works. And I think the people who have played football, scouted football for a long time, have so much wisdom and have seen so many players succeed and fail. Like if you're not drawing from that, that doesn't mean that they know that the running back from Oregon is going to be good or bad. But they've seen, a lot of players. One of the best things, for better or for worse, that we do in, I was saying scouting, you compare them to people you've seen previously. That tries to give you a picture. Now, there's a ton of bias, that comes in with that. Every white slot receiver is Julian Edelman, right? And
Before that, it was Wayne Corbett.
Correct.
Or Wes
yeah,
Welker.
Steve Largent. But I think there is this element of that helps so many people start to imagine and envision where this is going. And, if you want no different, and this is where I think we've gotten better as a league. If you want a really good scouting staff, you want a good scouting process, you need to have really hard-hitting, dirty discussions that people don't agree upon. And you need to, one of Les's focus is eliminating bias, but creating more conversation. The same way we would if we were talking about a marketing strategy or a ticketing strategy or anything else. We wouldn't just dismiss the experience. We'd say, okay, tell us more. And I think here we've pitted young and old, and I think that's the biggest, tried and true mistake you can make.
And I just want to follow up on that because implicit right in that question, immediately going to the place where the older person is stubborn, right, is identifying that person as something. Whereas the older person, too often we will look at someone that's younger with their ideas. I come up with a point of view and I'm called a boomer. No, I'm not. That's my point of view. I'm trying to help the group, right? And just like the young person comes to the table, no, be inclusive on your decision making and the conversations that lead to the decision making.
There's a ton of insight in the experience eye, and I don't think this is just football. I think this is many industries.
It's life.
Yeah, you have the same thing over and over again. And there's a ton of things that we'll not be able to measure. And I think human character is one that comes up all the time. Like, yes, I can tell you analytics of a game, but when I talk to John Idzik and he's like, I was watching some of his tape when he was injured, and I was looking at what he was doing when he was not playing. And I saw him on the sidelines, not necessarily paying attention. He wasn't coaching up, the other quarterback that was his backup. He wasn't behaving like a leader. And those, I'm only watching game tape. I'm only adding analytics on game tape. Those are such important things to call out when they're having the scouting discussions around leadership, around the character of that person. And so we were trying to marry the best of both worlds, right? So what are all the things you pay attention to? What are all the things you've learned that are critical, that will help you be successful in that scouting room? At the same time, what are all the things that we could have found as patterns, as anomalies? And the marrying of those two is where we had some really interesting debates.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I still think of myself as young, which I am not anymore. I still think of myself like mid-30s, early 30s, not late 40s. But it's interesting, like one of the places, it goes back to what you asked, like when I was at the Avs a couple weeks ago, we got to trading Mikko Rantanen to the Hurricanes. It was very analogous to a situation we had seen, at the Rams, trading a player who was coming up on a contract, right? Very different sports. And my perspective when I was sitting with Joe Sakic and Chris McFarland, our hockey leadership, was not, hey, I'm going to tell you whether you should trade Mikko Rantanen. And I'm like, here's what I learned when we went through this situation with the Rams. Does that help you think through this situation? Now, as I become the older, more boomer person, right? Like it's not that, hey, this is gospel, but I do think you can start to, these are all just decision making. It's not, and the more information you can process, the more life experience you can bring in, the better.
So we have 40 seconds left. Just because I want to know the answer to this question. Well, actually, I'll start with Larissa here. What's an innovation that we're not talking about that we will be in 5 years? From an analytics perspective, what's the most obvious upcoming progress, I guess?
I'm going to expand beyond analytics. I think AI in general is a topic everywhere, and how AI can be used is, there's so many things that we haven't even imagined that we're starting to see show up every single week. When we look at how we're going to leverage AI, we do start from a place of what does a coach need, what does a GM need, how could we help them see that? I think computer vision has continuously gotten better, and I think that's going to come into sports a lot more. Obviously, we saw the VR training with Jaden Daniels, but like I think those kinds of experiences where you're getting cycles of the brain without physically potentially exerting yourself and introducing risk are super interesting. And I think there's going to be more of that kind of experience, which feels almost like childish at first. When I talk to some folks, they're like, really? Feels like a video game. But I think we're starting to see some of that prove out.
Can I just comment on I know we're over, but the virtual reality thing, the Jaden Daniels thing was amazing because, again, being a boomer, I have to like see things to understand. And I do consulting work for LSU, was with Jaden his last 2 years. And there was a morning, I was there very early getting ready to do Good Morning Football. And he comes walking out of the room at LSU with his goggles and two guys that I know that aren't coaches. And I'm like, come on, Jaden, what did you get this morning? I thought he was showing up to see me, to make sure that I talked about him on TV. And he looks at me, his eyes go like this. And he's like, I've never played in Starkville. I've never been to Mississippi State. I know exactly where the play clocks are. I know what it looks like to walk out of the tunnel. All of the preparation work that I do to get ready for that game. He says, I've heard the cowbell, like at Starkville. I don't know if you know, the cowbell's a real thing. And he was prepared even though he had never been there, and virtual reality gave him that ability to prepare.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add, it's not as wise as that. We just, at the end of the year, we always do a football retreat. So this year we were in Napa, and a bunch of us went to dinner, probably drank a little bit too much. And so at the end, we had been wrestling with this question for about a couple hours during the day. So we just pulled out our phones and we asked Claude, what should we do? And the answer was damn spot on. And we're like, you know what? Like, I don't know why we're here thinking about this. Like, AI nailed, every factor that we were going into this decision. And I say that, like, I think when you take those two things together, the changes that are coming quickly in, how we process decisions, the information that exists, and bringing in different viewpoints, along with how we then give it to players and coaches and scouts who are trained in that, is going to be a game changer in how quickly we synthesize information. And then people will just critique the decisions the same. It's just maybe we'll make them faster.
Did AI tell you to stop drinking?
No, I think my head told me to stop drinking when I couldn't see straight. So.
Well, I do appreciate it. We know that VR can be used for cowbell clangs. That's a good piece of information.
It's a real thing.
Yeah, thanks. That's our time.
Thanks, Ron.